We are looking at verse 4. We have a theological basis for the ministry of government. Now, this is a principle that we've departed from. We in America have forgotten the theological origins or philosophical basis for the separation of church and state. There is a sense in which our founders saw and recognized a need for a separation. Not that church can't influence government. On the contrary, the church should influence government because it is the moral basis for the legitimacy of the laws that are passed by government. But in verse 4, Romans 13, we read that he, the leader, the king, is the minister of God to thee for good. So if you do evil, then be afraid, for the leader, the government, does not wield the sword in vain. He executes judgment. Verse 4 says, he is the minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So the government has legitimate authority to enforce the law. The government is the minister of justice. Justice, as we understand that as a character and nature of God, an attribute of God. Justice as that is expressed in our law, our written laws, which are a codification of what we understand to be the character and nature of God. An imposition or constraint upon our behavior. But understand what happens when the minister of God for justice begins to do the work of the church, which is to be the minister of God unto grace. What happens then is that we have government run amok. The church is supposed to be the minister of God's grace. The church is the helper. The church is the one who comes to the aid of the widows and the orphans. The church is that entity that helps the downtrodden and the poor and the weak. What's happened in our country? What's happened in our culture? What's happened with our government now is the government has either abandoned its role as justice, abandoned its role as the enforcer of the law, or at least downplayed it, and it's become almost totally interested in the welfare of the people, which is the ministry of the church. It is the responsibility of the church to be the minister of God unto grace. It is the church at the local level that knows who needs genuine help or who is a scammer, who is playing the system. We should know that in our community. We know who's playing the system, don't we? It is the church that is the minister of God unto righteousness, unto grace. It is the government that is the minister of God unto justice. So we execute God's justice. We administer the justice of God in righteousness through the system of government, through the form of government. And those laws, those justice laws, are enforced by the law enforcement. That's the enforcement branch of government. But when government becomes the minister of grace, we have runaway welfare, we have corruption, we have waste and fraud and abuse. What happens when the church becomes the minister of justice? What happens when the church oversteps its bounds and starts to try to execute, administer the laws? We end up with things like witch trials. We end up with things like the Inquisition. We may end up with something that, like the Crusades when they got out of hand. So it is the responsibility of the church to stay in its lane. It is the responsibility of government to stay in its lane. A separation of church and state, yes, in that sense, each one has its ministry. Each one has its legitimate function. Each one has a power that flows from that authority.